Britain was one of the most successful military aircraft exporters of the 20th century. The Hawker Hunter went to more than 20 air forces and stayed in frontline service, with some of them for over 50 years. The English Electric Canberra went to 15 countries and was license-built in both Australia and the United States. So when Britain produced the Avro Vulcan, bigger, more advanced, and more dramatic than any of them, you might expect at least one foreign air force to have wanted it. A huge delta-wing bomber that could carry nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. It looked futuristic. It had enormous range. It was one of the centerpieces of Britain's Cold War deterrent. Yet nobody bought it. Not a single foreign air force wanted one of the scariest bomber of the era. This is the story of why the best bomber Britain ever made, the Avro Vulcan, failed abroad. So to better understand why it failed abroad, you first have to look at what the Vulcan actually was, because it looked like a bomber, and technically it was one. But what the RAF really had was a nuclear deterrent delivery system. The Vulcan came out of Specification B.35 issued in January 1947, and the requirement was brutally specific: carry a British nuclear weapon into Soviet territory. A 10,000-pound bomb, 1,500 nautical miles, at high altitude and at high speed. That was the job, and almost everything about the aircraft was built around it. The big delta wing was shaped for high-altitude penetration. The bomb bay was sized around large nuclear weapons, and the aircraft carried no defensive guns because the whole plan was to survive on speed, height, and electronic countermeasures, which is where the export problem begins. Because buying a Vulcan did not just mean buying an aircraft. It meant buying the whole world around it, the long runways to operate from, the specialist crews to fly it, the heavy maintenance to keep it serviceable, tanker support to stretch its range, and above all, a reason to own a nuclear-capable bomber in the first place. The Canberra traveled so well because almost any air force could find a job for it. You could use it as a bomber, as a reconnaissance aircraft, as an interdictor, or even as a trainer. The Hunter was the same. It was flexible and easy to fit into an existing air force. But the Vulcan was not a general-purpose tool. It was a national weapon built around one very specific job. And once you took away the nuclear mission, what you had left was a very big and expensive way to drop conventional bombs. A job smaller aircraft could do with far less drama. So the customer list was almost gone before anyone even reached the price tag. If any country was going to buy a Vulcan, it should have been Australia. The Royal Australian Air Force needed range. It had commitments across Southeast Asia, and a very real reason to worry about long-range strike, especially once Indonesia began acquiring Soviet Tu-16 bombers, aircraft that could theoretically reach Australian cities. And Australia did look seriously at the Vulcan. In 1954, an Australian air mission visited Britain and the United States to find a replacement for the Canberra. It recommended either the Avro Vulcan or the Handley Page Victor, with the Vulcan as its first choice. On paper, it made sense. Australia needed something that could reach a long way out, and the Vulcan could do exactly that. But range on a brochure is not particularly the same thing as range an air force can actually use. The Vulcan weighed over 200,000 pounds at normal operating weight, too heavy for every Royal Australian Air Force airfield in Australia except Darwin. Australia had no tanker fleet to extend its range, and its entire bomber maintenance infrastructure was built around the Canberra, a twin-engine light bomber that was a fraction of the Vulcan's size and complexity. Britain operated the Vulcan from a network of 26 pre-prepared dispersal airfields. Australia had nothing like that. It would not just have been buying a long-range bomber, it would have been rebuilding its air force around one. So Australia kept looking, and in 1963 it chose the General Dynamics F-111C, an American swing-wing strike aircraft built for low-level penetration, modern avionics, and long-range tactical attack, which tells you exactly where the Vulcan fell short as an export product. Australia did not need a British nuclear bomber built around Moscow. It needed a regional strike aircraft that could reach Jakarta, and the F-111 gave it that, a genuine independent strike capability. And even the countries that got past the infrastructure problem still hit the next one, the cost of keeping a Vulcan in the air. 4 Olympus engines burning fuel at rates that dwarfed anything a Canberra operator was used to, a 5-man specialist crew per aircraft, 2 pilots, a navigator plotter, a navigator radar, and an air electronics officer. Training that crew pipeline took years to build from scratch. For a small air force buying 10 or 12 aircraft, the running costs would have exceeded the purchase price within a few years. The Vulcan was not just expensive to buy, it was expensive to own every single day it was in service. And this is the part that reframes the whole story, because the Vulcan's export failure was not really a British problem, it was a category problem. Nuclear bombers did not sell abroad. France is the proof. When France decided it wanted its own nuclear deterrent, it did not buy V-bombers from Britain. It built the Dassault Mirage 4, a supersonic nuclear bomber shaped around French weapons. It entered service in 1964, became the backbone of the force de frappe, and stayed in that role for more than 30 years. But just like the Vulcan, it went nowhere abroad. 62 were built, all for France. And the Soviet Union proved the same rule from the other side. The Tu-16 was exported. It went to Egypt, Indonesia, and Iraq, but the Soviets sold it as a conventional maritime strike platform, stripped of its nuclear role and adapted into something other air forces could actually use. Their real strategic nuclear bomber, the Tu-95 Bear, sold to nobody. Same pattern. The moment a bomber was tied to a national nuclear mission, it stopped being exportable. The moment it was flexible enough to sell, it was no longer really a strategic bomber. Because that is the thing about strategic bombers. Any country with the money and ambition to run one usually had the money and ambition to build its own. National deterrent weapons are not the kind of thing countries like to outsource. And any country without that ambition, any air force that just needed a strike aircraft or fighter bomber, had no reason to buy something as large, expensive, and specialized as a Vulcan or a Mirage 4. So the Vulcan was trapped. The countries that could use what it offered wanted their own version, and the countries that might actually buy British aircraft did not need what the Vulcan was offering. But even if somebody had signed a contract in the late 1950s, the window was already closing, because the whole idea of the high-altitude manned nuclear bomber was starting to come apart. Soviet surface-to-air missiles were getting better fast. The U-2 shootdown in 1960 proved that altitude alone could no longer keep an aircraft safe, and the RAF had to pull the Vulcan down into low-level penetration by the mid-1960s, a mission it could do thanks to that big delta wing, but not the mission it had been built around. Then in 1969, Britain moved its nuclear deterrent from RAF bombers to Royal Navy Polaris submarines. And that killed whatever export argument was left, because if Britain, the country that designed the Vulcan, built it, and operated it, no longer needed it for its main job, what exactly were you selling to everyone else? The V-bombers had entered service in the mid-1950s as the peak of strategic bombing, but within a decade, missiles and submarines were already making that whole idea look like yesterday's answer. The Vulcan's export window was not just small, it was closing almost from the moment the aircraft entered service. And there was one more obstacle that never went away. Even if a country wanted the Vulcan, could afford it, and had the infrastructure to operate it, Britain still had to approve the sale of a nuclear-capable platform. That meant political scrutiny on every potential customer. What did the buyer intend to do with an aircraft designed from the ground up to carry nuclear weapons? When Britain sold Hunters or Canberras, nobody asked what the buyer planned to nuke. With the Vulcan, that question was built into the aircraft. Argentina proved it. In 1981, Argentina showed serious interest in buying ex-RAF Vulcans, a deal that stalled once officials recognized the aircraft would be entirely suitable for an attack on the Falkland Islands. Less than 3 months later, Argentina invaded the Falklands, and the same type they had tried to buy was the one Britain sent south to bomb Port Stanley. But even that moment of combat glory showed exactly why the Vulcan was unexportable. The Black Buck raids were not some clean, self-contained bomber mission. They were a huge piece of operational choreography. The aircraft had to fly from Ascension Island, nearly 6,600 nautical miles there and back, with Victor tankers dragging it across the Atlantic, one refueling bracket at a time. For the first Black Buck raid, 11 tankers were assigned to support one Vulcan. And that is the part people forget. The Vulcan could do extraordinary things, but only when an entire air force was built around making those things possible. It needed tanker support, specialist crews, heavyweight runways, and a mission big enough to justify the headache. No export customer had that, and that is exactly why none of them bought it. So when you ask why nobody bought Britain's scariest bomber, the answer is not that the Vulcan was weak. It was almost the opposite. The Vulcan was so specialized and so tightly built around one very specific national nightmare that almost nobody else could make it fit. The Vulcan was not unwanted because it was bad. It was unwanted because it came with an entire Cold War strategy attached, and almost nobody else was buying that. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.